Hello, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. President Donald Trump called the Russian criminal strike on the center of Ukrainian Sumy a terrible mistake. I think it was terrible, Donald Trump replied to journalists' questions. I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a terrible thing. I believe that this whole war is terrible. Journalist, how is this? Often in communication with Trump, he couldn't believe his ears and asked again, really? The American president believes that the strike by the Russian missile was a mistake. Trump again confirmed that the Russians, whom he did not call Russians but exclusively referred to as they, made a mistake, and believes that this is indeed the case. Look, ask them, said Donald Trump, who of course did not forget to remind that this is Biden's war, not his war. It is worth emphasizing Biden's war, not Putin's war, with whom Donald Trump continues, in his own words, to have a good relationship. As is known, the U.S. Secretary of State was forced to respond to the Russian strike on Sumy, Marco Rubio, and the special representative of the U.S. President on the regulation of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Keith Kello. Unlike the strikes on Kryvyi Rih, about which no one in the State Department said anything, and the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, in its first message about the strike, did not even mention Russia. Now, both the U.S. Secretary of State, the special representative of the President, and numerous members of the American elite had to speak out regarding this demonstrative crime by the Russians. Perhaps also because it happened precisely on Palm Sunday, to thus emphasize President Putin of Russia's complete indifference to all these peacekeeping initiatives. President Trump of the USA, well, and everyone condemns this Russian strike, and no one talks about its mistake, while Trump continues to assert that a mistake was made. Why? Trump himself uses the phrase, I was told, and one can imagine that he was misinformed by people from his own circle. Let's say the same special representative of the American president, Steve Witthop, who has already held 3 meetings with the president of Russia and is obviously captivated by all these financial proposals that can be offered by Putin during negotiations with the American developer, who enjoys enormous trust from Donald Trump. But the matter here obviously is not about Witthop, if only because he these days is busy with those travels between St. Petersburg and the Middle East, where a whole series of negotiations related to the main issues of this region continues. And to imagine that at the moment of the Russian strike on Sumy, Witthop immediately called Trump, who was preoccupied with the unveiling of his own monument, and told him, Mr. Donald, this is a mistake. This is not an intentional Russian strike. I myself can't quite imagine, and I don't even want to look for people in Trump's circle who tell him such nonsense, because I am sincerely convinced that such nonsense can be produced by Trump himself, who, of course, can refer to some unknown sources to avoid taking responsibility for his own words. If Trump agrees that Putin is deliberately striking peaceful Ukrainian cities, then he will have to answer both to himself and to the journalist he gathers on board the presidential plane. And why does he have such a good relationship with a person who kills civilians on Palm Sunday? And he is such a virtuous Christian and so sympathetic to all virtuous Christians. And so both Trump and members of his team demonstrate all their piety is absolutely, I think, demonstrative, which has nothing to do with reality, because we understand that people who believe in something other than money and their own grandeur, well, never would behave like Donald Trump, members of his closest circle, and of course his supporters. It can be said with certainty that these people do not believe in anything. neither in God nor in the devil, but only in their dubious financial success, here and now, and all for the sake of this year. If Trump acknowledged that Putin is deliberately shelling peaceful Ukrainian cities, he would have to consider increasing sanctions against the Russian regime and against the Russian state. And he didn't even bother to announce that he extended the sanctions against Russia, which were imposed by his predecessor, President Joseph Biden. Unlike all other decrees of the American president, which he signs in front of cameras with his characteristic pomp and with answers to journalists' questions. And by the way, let me remind you that the vast majority of these decisions are absolute nonsense, which later have to be refuted and corrected. For example, like that famous tariff decree by Trump, which turned him into a laughingstock. One could say all over the world, not to mention the frightened Americans who will soon have to say goodbye to their long-term savings forever, this decree on sanctions against Russia was signed in complete secrecy, and we would have known nothing about the fact that the American president extended Biden's sanctions if it weren't for the publication in the relevant official sources where such documents simply cannot go unpublished. If Trump admitted that Putin was deliberately striking the peaceful Ukrainian cities, he would have to ask himself, answer the question, why is he conducting meaningless negotiations with the Russian president? Why did he call him on the phone? Twice humiliated himself when Putin clearly responded to him no to his proposal to announce a 90-day truce on the Russian-Ukrainian front. Why does Vitop constantly fly to Putin, who should be dealing with more serious matters such as the Middle East and Iran, rather than trying to convince the Russian president of something in which Putin simply cannot be convinced? But since Trump is not one of those people who can tell themselves the truth, he continues to tell us about Putin's mistakes while Putin is committing a crime. But I am certain that Putin will not give Trump the opportunity to overlook his crimes. Sooner or later, the Russian president will make the American his accomplice. If Trump lacks the basic courage to tell himself the truth about how he behaves in relations with the Russian president and in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and people like Trump hate the truth more than anything in the world. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow my social media, the channel on Patreon, buy me a coffee, Ko-fi, Donatella, which help develop these resources. Use the sponsorship options right on YouTube. Victory and peace to you. Good luck.